We are going to be covering the 9 major plant groups. And as we go through each of these groups, you're going to need to know the defining characteristics of them. You're going to need to know or be able to place those characteristics on a phylogenetic tree and interpret or explain the phylogenetic relationship between these major 9 groups. So within these groups, there's actually only 4 major groups, and those major groups are broken down into smaller groups. So we get 9 categories, but we're really just learning 4 major groups of plants here. I strongly suggest that you make some flashcards for each of these groups. Write down an example that you'll remember, or draw a picture, something like that. That's going to help you. As we get farther in evolution towards our angiosperms, these plants are going to become more and more familiar, and you may be familiar with specimens of all of them already. So we are going to look at the 4 main groups of plants. There are 9 phyla within these 4 groups. In your study guide that I handed out at the beginning of the semester, you should have this phylogeny. On the far left, we have our green algae. So these guys are not land plants, but they're here because they are the closest living relatives. And you'll notice way down here at the bottom, we have chlorophyll A, B, and starch produced in plastids. So these are some very important characteristics of land plants. All of our land plants are going to produce chlorophylls, and all of them are going to store energy as starch. So these are key characteristics, and that's why our green algae are here on this phylogeny, because that is where those characteristics evolved. And then once we reach our second group here, starting with these simple streptophyte algae, we see cellulose-rich cell walls. So cellulose cell walls are key to plants. We've been learning since Biology 101 that cellulose builds up those cell walls. So starting at this second group of algae, that's going to be our streptophytes. And then we have just slightly more complex streptophytes, and then we get to our land plants. Our land plants fall into 4 groups. These first 3 here, the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts, fall into the bryophyte or non-vascular plant groups. Next, we've got the lycophytes and pteridophytes. These are our seedless vascular plants. These are basically our ferns and fern relatives. And then our third group is going to be the gymnosperms. These are our cone-bearing plants, our naked seed plants. And then our fourth group are the angiosperms. So you are probably pretty familiar with conifers, which fall into the gymnosperm category. These are some of our evergreens and cone-bearing plants, and you're definitely familiar with angiosperms, our flowering plants. So you do need to know all of these groups. You need to know the characteristics of their major parent group, the bryophytes, the vascular plants, the seedless vascular plants, and then our seeded vascular plants, which are the gymnosperms. And then last, we have these angiosperms over here. So you definitely need to know these 4 groups and what organisms fall into each group. You are also going to need to know the key characteristics on a phylogenetic tree. So you may be asked to label them. You may be asked to describe which of these define certain groups. So definitely work on those study guides. Definitely work on your phylogenetic trees and make sure you know the different types and the defining features of each of them. Great. So our first plants are the non-vascular plants. Non-vascular plants are plants that do not have a system for moving water and nutrients throughout the plant. Basically, they do not have tubes that run from one part of the plant or another. To put this in perspective, you have a vascular system that pumps air in and around your lungs. It pumps that air along your lungs so that your blood can pick up oxygen, and then your blood moves your nutrients, it moves oxygen, it moves water throughout your body. That is a vascular system. Many plants also have a vascular system that is going to move water and nutrients from one region of the plant to another. So our very, very first land plants didn't have this, and they didn't have it because their ancestors didn't need it. Their ancestors, the green algae, were fully submerged in water, and so they didn't have to have a vascular system. They didn't have to have a way to transport nutrients and water through their system because it could move by diffusion and osmosis. And as plants started to move out of the water, it quickly became apparent that being able to move nutrients through the plant was a great way to conserve that water. But our early plants didn't have this type of system. So our first group of plants that we're going to look at are these plants that have moved out of the water but are still very largely dependent on being in a damp environment because they do not have that vascular system to move them through. To move the water and nutrients through. So these are our liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. I'm sure you have all seen mosses. We definitely look at them in our lab, but they grow, they kind of look carpet-like in real shady spots, say along wooded paths or dark corners, dark sheltered areas where it doesn't dry out quite as much. You might get a lot of sprinkler action or a lot of pooling in rain. And so they basically kind of look a little bit carpet-like. Because they rely on diffusion and osmosis, they cannot grow tall. Diffusion and osmosis is a very slow process, and it doesn't work over large areas very well. It doesn't work over long distances. And so since they don't have vascular tissue to move all of those nutrients and water around, they can't grow very tall. The other important thing is that a vascular system is going to provide structural support. The reason is that a vascular system has essentially reinforced cell walls to make them extra strong. And without that structural support from the vascular tissue, the plant cannot grow large. So the vascular tissue is kind of doing two things in a land plant. It's providing a means to transport water, but it's also providing structural support. And so because our bryophytes don't have a vascular system, they don't have that support which allows them to grow tall. So essentially they're lacking two key things that are going to help them to grow tall. They don't have the vascular system, and they don't have a support system that is provided by the vascular system. So that means they have to be in damp habitats. And this does not mean fully submerged in water, but it means places where there is a lot of water where it doesn't dry out. So you're not going to find a lot of mosses growing in a desert. You're not going to find moss growing on a sunny path. You're not going to find moss in a place that has a lot of afternoon sun. They're going to grow in the dark, shady places. They're going to grow in the damp places. They're going to grow in places where water is not a problem. But they also require those moist habitats because they rely on flagellated sperm. So plants reproduce sexually, but at least these early bryophytes are going to have flagellated sperm, which is a holdover from being full-time in the water as algae. So those flagellated sperm do just what they do in humans. They swim to the egg. and you need a wet environment for that to happen. So in order for our bryophytes to reproduce, they require water. In our bryophytes, they are a dominant gametophyte generation. So we haven't talked about alternation of generations yet, but we are about to. And in our moss, you can see these two different multicellular bodies that we were talking about. Down here on the bottom is the gametophyte. The gametophyte, remember, is the structure that is going to produce the gamete. Up on top, we have the sporophyte. This is growing out of the gametophyte. And within that gametophyte is the sporangia. So that's this structure here, this kind of rounded droplet-shaped structure on the top. That sporangium is going to produce the spores. This image here just shows kind of the tip end of the sporangium, and all of these little structures here, those are spores that are being released out of the sporangium. Sometimes they break, it just kind of depends on the structure. So our bryophytes are going to have a gametophyte dominant generation. They are low to the ground, damp, etc. And then the sporangium is going to grow out. They're just long enough to release their spores, and then they kind of shrivel up and die. So our land plants that we are generally familiar with are going to be sporophyte dominant, and this will be more clear once we talk about it. But I'm going to give you a little hint. If you are asked if something is a gametophyte or a sporophyte, you will need to know for this class what structures constitute both. In our bryophytes, the gametophyte is the dominant carpet-like structure. In every plant after our bryophytes, the sporophyte is the dominant generation. So if you go outside right now and you look at a maple tree, that whole maple tree is the sporophyte. If you go outside and look at a rose bush, the whole rose bush is the sporophyte. You look at a lily flower, sporophyte. You look at a weed growing in the grass. You look at the grass. Those are all sporophytes. In everything after our bryophytes, you can't even see the gametophyte generation. So identifying the sporophyte is actually super easy in all of our land plants. Identifying the gametophyte is a little bit tougher, and you generally need a microscope to do it. Here are two examples of the liverworts and the hornworts. They also have that kind of carpety structure. They're a little bit different, but you can see we've got this sort of thicker structure down at the bottom, and then we've got the sporophyte that grows up out of the top. So these are just two different structures. You can read the descriptions here. I have not ever seen a liverwort or a hornwort to my knowledge. It's possible I have, but I don't know. Moss is definitely easy to find in Illinois. We usually have some around the lab if you want to see any. If you haven't seen some yet, just go ahead and ask. This image here shows a general alternation of generations life cycle. This is actually the fern life cycle. In a minute, we're going to talk about the mosses, but this one is just, I love this image because it's super simple. It just kind of very nicely summarizes what's happening and what the major parts are. So it would probably be a good idea to learn a simple alternation of generations without all of the different crazy structures. The nice thing about this one is you can see in lab a gametophyte model for the fern alternation of generations. And we also have a big, lovely fern plant in our lab. So you can see both of them, whereas we may not have moss all the time. But general idea for alternation of generations, we're going to start down here with the zygote. The zygote is the fertilized egg. So we get gamete from one plant, gamete to another. So we've got a diploid gamete. This diploid gamete is going to divide by mitosis to produce the sporophyte plant. Then the sporophyte is going to produce spores, because remember, the sporophyte is our spore-producing multicellular body. So that sporophyte is going to produce spores. Spores are haploid. They are produced by meiosis. So this is a little bit different from what we learned in Biology 101. In meiosis, in 101, we produce gametes, but in alternation of generation, we produce spores. The difference here is that, the thing that's the same is that the spore is also haploid. So meiosis still takes a diploid sporophyte and produces a haploid spore. That spore then grows into the gametophyte. So we've got we'll just call it the plant because that's what you're familiar with. The plant, the sporophyte, produces haploid spores. Those spores grow into the gametophyte, and they grow by mitosis, just like you grow by mitosis. Then those gametophytes are going to produce the gametes, because remember, the gametophyte is the multicellular body of the plant that's producing the gamete. If we are going to maintain our chromosome number, we have to do mitosis. So the gametophyte is going to produce gametes by mitosis, because the gametophyte is already 1N, and we need to produce these gametes. So then the gametes are going to come together. We're going to produce our zygote. Now, this alternation of generations is going to be the same process for all of our plants, except some of the details are going to be a little bit different, okay? So in our mosses, the sporophyte is the little tiny one. The gametophyte is the big one. After that, all of our plants, the plant that we see is the sporophyte. The gametophyte is hidden inside. But they all do the same thing. Gametes combine to make that zygote. Zygote grows into the sporophyte. Sporophyte produces haploid spores by meiosis. Those spores grow into the gametophyte, and then the gametophyte produces gametes by mitosis. So let's take a look at the moss life cycle, the alternation of generations. And the reason I start with that lovely picture on the previous slide is that it is much more simple than what's going on here. Okay, so we are going to look down here. This is the male gametophyte. So think about that picture of moss that I showed you a minute ago, the carpety moss, kind of carpet-like, and then we've got that single sporangium coming up with this, the sporophyte coming up with the sporangia. This is this structure down here on the bottom, the carpet-like structure. So the male gametophyte, we just learned that the male gametophyte is going to produce male gametes by mitosis, because the gametophyte is already haploid. So the gametophyte is going to produce haploid gametes in a structure called the antheridium. And we learned the word gametangia in the previous slide, previous video. In general, this is going to be called the antheridia. The male structure that produces the male gametes is called the antheridia. All right. over here in the center, we have a female gametophyte. Remember, female gametes are also going to be 1N. This is our carpet-like structure down here on the bottom. And that female gametophyte is going to produce an egg by mitosis because the gametophyte is already 1N. So that egg is going to combine with the sperm from the male and produce a zygote. I forgot one thing. The female structure that is going to produce the egg is called the archegonium. So you should know those two words, antheridium and archegonium. Antheridium is where the male gametes are produced. Archegonium is where the female gametes are produced. So the egg is going to meet the sperm, and this is going to produce a fertilized zygote. So you guys are familiar with this from Biology 101. Haploid sperm meets a haploid egg, we get a fertilized zygote. That fertilized zygote is going to divide into an embryo, which is 2N. That embryo is going to divide by mitosis into the sporophyte. So this is a moss, just like this structure over here. This moss has a little tiny sporophyte on it growing out of the gametophyte. That sporophyte is diploid. And that sporophyte is going to produce these little spores. All right, so then we start over. These little spores are going to be released from the sporangium, and those little tiny spores are going to fall on some damp soil, and they are going to grow into this little spore right here. It's going to grow into a female gametophyte. And one of these little spores over here, maybe from another plant, grows into the male gametophyte. And then we start this all over. So I would suggest that you go through, write down each of these steps. Step 1, meiosis within the sporophyte. Step 2, haploid spores. Write them down and draw a really quick diagram. You don't even have to draw the structures. You could sketch the structures. You could just describe what it is. But I would suggest writing down each of these steps, and then you'll have them in your notes. In your packet, in your homework packet, not homework, study guide packet, you should have an alternation of generations. If you do not, you can go to your skeletal outline notes, and there will be one there that you can use.